I will explain the origin of the first particle, the primordial sphere. Beginning with the quantum square, static energy is converted to free energy that condenses to matter and compounds to mass. Mass produces gravity that converts static energy into free energy that condenses into matter and compounds to mass, producing gravitational fields sufficient to convert the static energy. The interaction between free energy and mass is motion. The interaction between static energy and matter is gravity. Magnetic fields generally are not sufficient to convert static energy until the matter compounds into mass sufficient to produce a magnitude of gravitational field sufficient to convert the static energy into free energy. This is a perpetuating process that increases exponentially, and it shall continue and will never cease. This is a visualization metaphor for intergalactic space that contains dust and gases and subatomic particles, high energy waves, and gravitational fields, producing an opaque appearance like a cloudy ice cube. The space outside the universe, that is exospace, contains no dust, no gases, no subatomic particles, no energy waves, no fields, no motion whatsoever. It is static energy. The infinite void is static energy. Before the universe began, this is all that existed. Then all of infinity at complete uniformity and total equilibrium with infinite enthalpy. That is, infinite distance, infinite pressure, and infinite zero thermal value. Then, at one point through all of the expanse of time, an anomaly developed, formed an asymmetry as a low pressure in the infinite equilibrium. This zero dimension formed a scalar point of free energy, and that developed a direction in the infinite space, producing the first dimension as a trace vector that was a straight line. So our point of origin then formed a scalar point of free energy that advanced into a straight line vector. This could be only a straight line since there's nothing outside of it to cause any change in angularity. It could not be a curvature. It is strictly a straight line. Then, as there's nothing outside to interact with it, as it reached a particular length, it reacted to its own presence in space. And that produced an offset where then the pressure was directly proportional to the temperature. And as it extended from the low pressure, it warmed unevenly. And that offset of temperature from one side to the other produced a one-dimensional torsion. Then that effect was a trajectory. Then that formed the second dimension, and as the trajectory extended, it increased the imbalance. And that caused a compensatory effect where it cycled back the opposite direction. So the trajectory produced a compensatory cycle forming the second dimension. As that progressed, then that developed instability in an oscillation that formed a sine wave, and that created the third dimension. As this trace extended through the sine wave, its efficiency increased, and it transitioned from a shorter wavelength to a longer wavelength. It increased in temperature, and the velocity was proportional to the temperature. Then, at one point, eventually, it completed the phase in the third dimension and developed sufficient angular momentum that produced a curvature. And that was the consequence of the infinite zero environment, forming a contrast to the inside and outside temperature variations on the trace, where then there was a variation in pressure, variation in temperature, and proportion difference in relative velocity between the inside and the outside of the trace. Then that caused the trace to develop into an orbital plane from the fact that the curvature then continued in a relative equilibrium, although it increased in temperature slightly. Then, at the point where it returned to the place of the beginning in the orbital plane, it encountered resistance and friction. Resistance and friction. And that formed the fourth dimension. Then, as it progressed, that developed spin. And the spin in this trace allowed it to continue in an outward spiral where it spun off energy and produced a vortex. Then, as it advanced in the outward spiral, the resistance caused that to increase in temperature, and in the friction that developed, it decreased in velocity. So then the resistance created a decrease in velocity from the friction in the trace from the previous orbital plane, and that caused an apogee to create an equilibrium to the infinite zero. So the outside of the trace became equal to infinite zero. The inside of the trace was yet slightly colder. Then that also produced a pressure variation, and that caused the trace to descend from its orbit into the vortex that it created, and it impacted at the point of origin. Then that impaction completed the circuit from beginning to the end. And then that circuit produced a unified field of energy. Then the trace fractured, and the fracturing created fragments, and the fragments were ejected and expelled in all directions. Then those fragments were captured in the field produced by the completed circuit at the point of impaction. So then these captured fragments formed a spheroid. Then this had a positive thermal value compared to the infinite zero environment. So then this caused the result of a stabilization effect. And that stabilization then formed surface tension. The surface tension in the environment where there is no external force, there's nothing outside of it to cause any deformation, then it formed a perfect sphere. Then inside the sphere, the energies condensed. And as they condense, they form concentrates. So the energies condensed into concentrates, represented here as blue, green, and red. Anyway, then this geometric alignment caused the effect of synergy. Then that synergistic effect was heat. Then that heat inside the surface tension of the sphere formed pressure. heat and pressure. Then that caused the sphere to expand. Then that expansion eventually caused the pressure to exceed the resistance in the surface tension, and the sphere exploded. Then that explosion is commonly referred to as the Big Bang event. And then that explosion allowed this internal geometry that formed to produce an external impetus. So it developed an impetus based upon the internal geometry. And that formed a basis for conventional matter. And conventional matter compounds into mass. And then through accretion, the mass formed gravitational fields. So gradually, then, these gravitational fields were sufficient to convert static energy into free energy, and free energy to condense into matter, compounds into mass to form an increase in gravitational fields. So this process increases exponentially and expands continuously. Then matter extends the distance in the static energy with zero resistance. And the process continues. So now that completes the fundamental formula. So now if any of you brilliant scientists and mathematicians could apply the numerical calculations to this word problem, then you might contribute something significant to the realm of astrophysics. So I've been developing this metaphysics formula for over 35 years now. And only recently I completed the descriptive aspect. So whether this is conjecture or this is theory, I will leave that for you to determine. So, now, for those of you who believe in God, there's an additional explanation. And that is, during the time when this primordial sphere developed its geometric alignments, there was no comparison to size in the infinite void, and there is no measurement of time in relative terms. So then, with that information, this sphere was sufficient to produce conditions that would potentially allow the evolution of a life form, and the life form then could potentially evolve into an advanced intelligence inside the sphere. Then, given that the word for God is Elohim, that is plural in form and singular in usage, then this life form with advanced intelligence formed this orderly arrangement of internal geometry, and then easily could replicate its genetic structure internally into numerous individuals. And those individuals then, of identical genetic quality, could encapsulate themselves individually, separately, inside the sphere, with the specific intention to control the external environment that resulted from the explosion. So then all of the internal geometry is arranged with the specific intention to create an external habitat for the individuals that are expelled out in the debris field from the explosion. Then each individual has sufficient proximity to all regions in the universe to assert significant influence and control over the developing universe. And essentially that completes my presentation. My name is Gregory James Owsley, ID U0122022, in Sacramento, California, on May 1st, 2016. All rights reserved.